I remember that wrinkled gray shirt I wore that day, the one I should have thrown out last year. It was hanging in my closet like a silent witness to all the times I'd settled for less than I deserved. The fabric had lost its crispness years ago, much like my enthusiasm for a job that had slowly been draining the life out of me. I had arrived at the office at 5 in the morning to fix someone else's mess before an important demo. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting their harsh glow on empty desks and abandoned coffee cups from the night before. The building felt like a tomb at that hour, with only the hum of servers and the distant sound of traffic beginning to pick up outside. Then he walked in without knocking, throwing a stack of papers on my desk like he was dealing cards in a high-stakes poker game. His shoes clicked against the polished floor with an authority he'd only recently acquired, each step echoing through the silence of the early morning office. "Congratulations, Ryan, you're the lucky one?" Mark Lenoir stood there with his hands on his hips, wearing that smug expression I'd grown to despise over the past few months. His transformation from drinking buddy to corporate executioner had been swift and merciless. The man who once complained about management over beers after work had become everything we used to mock. "My name is Ryan McCall. I'm 31 years old, and I've been a senior solutions engineer at Orion DataWorks for the past 6 years. Our office sits in a glass tower in downtown Denver, Colorado, where the Rocky Mountains loom in the distance like sleeping giants. On clear days, you can see them from the 19th floor, their snow-capped peaks reminding you that there's a world beyond spreadsheets and quarterly reports. It was a Friday in the middle of Q2, and rumors had been swirling for weeks about losing our biggest contract with a defense contractor. The whispers started in the break room and spread through Slack channels like wildfire. People huddled in conference rooms with worried expressions, speaking in hushed tones about restructuring and budget cuts. The company had just announced a 30% workforce reduction. The list of terminations included my closest colleagues, people who had taught me everything I knew about this business, Jared Morrison, who'd shown me how to optimize database queries when I was fresh out of college, Nina Castellanos, whose expertise in client relations had saved more deals than anyone could count, Luis Ramirez, the back-end wizard who could make servers sing in harmonies most people couldn't even imagine. Their names were highlighted in yellow on the termination list, as if someone had used a highlighter to mark them for deletion. It felt obscene somehow, reducing human beings to colored text on a corporate spreadsheet. These weren't just employees being let go. They were my mentors, my friends, the people who made coming to work bearable on the worst days. Mark had been promoted just 3 months earlier, elevated from senior developer to VP of engineering in a move that surprised everyone, including Mark himself. We used to grab drinks at Murphy's Pub down the street, complaining about upper management's disconnect from reality. Now he was the disconnect, standing on the other side of an invisible line that separated the decision-makers from the casualties. "You're getting the responsibilities of 3 people," Mark continued, his voice carrying that artificial confidence of someone trying to convince himself as much as me. 18 client accounts, full back-end maintenance for our industrial systems, and daily technical reporting processes. It's a big opportunity. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. The morning sun was starting to filter through the office windows, casting long shadows across the empty desks of people who wouldn't be coming back on Monday. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional ping of an email notification. "Mark, that's literally impossible," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're talking about 120 hours of work per week, minimum. Nobody can do that job." He shrugged with practiced indifference, the kind of gesture consultants teach in management seminars. "Plenty of people would kill to be in your position right now. The market's tough out there." The threat was implicit but clear. Take it or join the 30% heading for the exits. It was extortion dressed up as opportunity, wrapped in corporate speak that made exploitation sound like advancement. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, exactly, but develop a hairline fracture that would spread over the coming hours. These people who had taught me everything, who had believed in me when I was just another college graduate with more enthusiasm than experience, were being discarded like outdated equipment. and I was expected to smile and say thank you for the privilege of doing their jobs along with my own. Mark turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Ryan, I need your decision by 5 o'clock today. No point dragging this out." After he left, I sat alone in my cubicle, staring at the stack of papers he'd dropped: client contact lists, system documentation, maintenance schedules, the accumulated knowledge of 3 skilled professionals reduced to a few dozen pages of bullet points and procedure manuals. It was like trying to compress a symphony into a ringtone. The office began to fill with the usual Friday morning energy, people grabbing coffee, catching up on overnight emails, making weekend plans. But there was an undercurrent of tension that everyone could feel. Conversations were quieter, laughter was forced, and people kept glancing toward the conference room where HR had been conducting termination meetings since 8 a.m. I watched Jared clean out his desk, 22 years of professional life condensed into a cardboard box. Nina hugged her team members goodbye, maintaining her composure even as tears threatened to spill. Luis just sat at his computer, staring at the screen like he was trying to memorize every line of code he'd ever written. They were professionals to the end, handling their dismissals with more grace than the company deserved. But I could see the hurt in their eyes, the bewilderment of people who had given their best years to an organization that viewed them as expendable assets. By noon, the departed had cleared out their belongings and said their goodbyes. The office felt hollow, like a theater after the audience has gone home. Empty desks stood as monuments to corporate efficiency, each one representing a life disrupted, a family affected, a career trajectory altered forever. I spent the afternoon in Conference Room C, officially to review the transition documents, but really just to avoid the sympathetic looks and whispered conversations happening throughout the office. The room was glass-walled, offering a panoramic view of the office floor and the chaos of rearranged responsibilities being distributed among the survivors. Mark sent me a Slack message at 4:45 p.m. Decision time, 5 minutes. I told him I needed the weekend to prepare a proper transition plan. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did need time to plan, just not the kind of transition he was expecting. The drive home was treacherous. Rain pounded against my windshield with the fury of a Colorado thunderstorm, and I could barely see the road ahead. I pulled over twice, ostensibly to wait out the worst of the weather, but really because my hands were shaking too hard to maintain a steady grip on the steering wheel. Sitting in my car with rain drumming on the roof, I had a moment of absolute clarity. I wasn't going to quit quietly. I wasn't going to accept an impossible workload and burnout trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I was disposable. And I definitely wasn't going to let Mark get away with thinking he could manipulate people's livelihoods without consequences. By the time I got home, the plan was already forming in my mind. Naomi was waiting for me with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine. She's a clinical psychologist with a master's degree from the University of Colorado, and she has this uncanny ability to read people's emotional states from across a room. One look at my face told her everything she needed to know. "How bad?" she asked, setting down her chopsticks. I told her everything. The layoffs, the impossible workload, Mark's ultimatum, the whole sordid mess. She listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What are you thinking?" she finally asked. "I'm thinking about making Mark understand what irreplaceable really means." She studied my face with those sharp psychologist eyes. "This is crazy, but it's the right kind of crazy." We spent the rest of Friday evening talking through the implications, the risks, the potential consequences. Naomi helped me understand the psychological dynamics at play, how Mark's newfound power had corrupted his judgment, how the company's fear-based management style was ultimately self-destructive, how my response could either liberate me or destroy my career. By midnight, we had the framework of a plan. Saturday morning, I drove to the office under the pretense of getting a head start on the transition. The building was nearly empty, just a few dedicated souls catching up on work or preparing for Monday's challenges. I had my key card and knew the security guard's weekend routine well enough to avoid unwanted attention. I spent 6 hours methodically documenting everything. Email threads where Mark had made promises he couldn't keep. project logs showing his technical incompetence, system error reports that traced back to his ill-conceived optimizations, customer complaint records that had been buried or ignored, budget discrepancies that suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate falsification of performance metrics. The picture that emerged was devastating. Mark hadn't just been promoted beyond his competence, he'd been actively damaging the company while positioning himself as the solution to problems he'd created. It was a masterclass in corporate manipulation, and I had the documentation to prove every claim. Sunday was dedicated to analysis and presentation. I created 2 documents. The first was a detailed workload assessment showing the mathematical impossibility of one person handling 3 full-time positions. I broke down every responsibility by hours required, expertise needed, and potential failure points. It was 47 pages of meticulous analysis that no reasonable person could dispute. The second document was a 12-page report addressed to the board of directors, documenting Mark's pattern of mismanagement, the security vulnerabilities he'd created, and the customer relationships he'd damaged through negligence and poor decision-making. I included timestamps, screenshots, email threads, and system logs. Everything needed to paint a complete picture of executive failure. Naomi reviewed both documents Sunday evening, bringing her academic rigor to bear on my corporate warfare strategy. She suggested several improvements to the presentation and helped me anticipate potential counterarguments. By the time we finished, we'd created something that was part professional assessment, part legal brief, and part psychological warfare manual. "You realize there's no going back after this," she said, as we sat in our living room surrounded by printed pages and highlighted documents. "I know, but going forward wasn't really an option either." Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m., earlier than usual, but not suspiciously so. I placed the workload assessment on Mark's chair where he couldn't miss it, then went to my desk to wait. Mark arrived at his usual 8:15, coffee in hand, and that swagger in his step that new authority tends to create. I watched through the glass walls of his office as he discovered the document, saw his expression change from casual confidence to growing concern as he read through the pages. He appeared at my cubicle 20 minutes later, the report clutched in his hand like evidence of a crime. "What the hell is this supposed to be?" "It's a professional assessment of the workload you assigned me," I replied, keeping my voice level and professional. "I thought you should understand what you're asking for." "This is insubordination." "No, this is documentation. You asked me to do an impossible job. I'm showing you why it's impossible." Mark's voice began rising, drawing attention from nearby cubicles. "You think you're irreplaceable? You think you can manipulate me with charts and graphs?" I stood up slowly, aware that half the office was now watching our exchange. Several people had their phones out, undoubtedly recording what was shaping up to be an epic confrontation. "I think you don't understand the difference between leadership and bullying," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And I think you're about to learn a very expensive lesson about treating people like they're disposable." Mark's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "My office. Now..." We walked through the maze of cubicles toward his glass-walled sanctuary, every step observed by colleagues who sensed something significant was happening. The office had gone completely quiet except for the clicking of keyboards and the occasional whispered comment. Once inside his office with the door closed, Mark turned on me with the fury I'd been expecting. "You want to play games? You want to make me look bad in front of the whole office? I can fire you right now, today, and you'll never work in this industry again." I reached into my laptop bag and pulled out the second document, the 12-page report I'd compiled over the weekend. I placed it on his desk with the deliberate ceremony of someone playing their final card. "I sent this to the board of directors at 8:45 this morning," I said quietly. "Every member, including the external auditors they hired last month." Mark's bluster died as he opened the report and began reading. I watched his face go through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, the pale realization of someone who understands they've been completely outmaneuvered. The document was comprehensive and damning. It detailed the security breach he'd caused by disabling firewall protocols to improve performance. It included customer complaints he'd buried because they reflected poorly on his decisions. It showed how he'd manipulated project timelines to make his department look more efficient while passing delayed work to other teams. Most damaging of all, it provided evidence that he'd been falsifying performance metrics in reports to senior management. "This is all taken out of context," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The timestamps and email threads provide plenty of context. So do the system logs and customer complaint records." Mark sank into his chair. The report spread across his desk like an indictment. For a moment, the corporate mask slipped, and I saw something almost human in his expression. Fear, regret, maybe even the beginning of self-awareness. "What do you want?" he asked. I reached into my bag again and pulled out my letter of resignation, placing it next to the report. "I quit, effective immediately, but I'm not leaving you with a mess." Mark's eyes darted between the resignation letter and the report, trying to process this latest development. "You can't quit. We need you for the transition." "You needed Jared, Nina, and Luis, too. That didn't stop you from throwing them away like broken equipment." I had one more card to play, and this was the moment to reveal it. By the way, they're all starting at Zentrix Tech next Monday. Jared as Senior Database Architect, Nina as Director of Client Relations, and Luis as Lead Backend Engineer. They're getting 30% raises and equity packages. Mark's face went from pale to ashen. Zentrix Tech was our biggest competitor, and the three people he dismissed knew everything about our client base, our technical infrastructure, and our competitive vulnerabilities. You can't do that. Non-compete agreements apply to current employees, not terminated ones. Your legal department might want to review the severance documents they had everyone sign. The final revelation hit him like a physical blow. I'm starting there too. Chief Technology Officer, 40% raise, full benefits, and a team of people who actually value competence over politics. Mark stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the window with a sharp crack. "This is corporate espionage. I'll sue you. I'll sue all of you. You'll never work again." I smiled for the first time in days, a genuine expression of satisfaction that felt like sunshine after a long winter. You really want all of this to come out in court? Discovery processes are fascinating things. They tend to reveal so much more than people expect. The threat was hollow, and we both knew it. A lawsuit would require Mark to explain why he'd driven away his most valuable employees, why he'd created security vulnerabilities, why he'd falsified performance reports. The board would ask questions he couldn't answer without admitting to gross incompetence or deliberate malfeasance. I picked up my laptop bag and headed for the door, then paused for one final exchange. "Mark, you used to be a decent guy. Power didn't corrupt you. It revealed who you really were underneath all the friendly small talk and shared complaints about management. That's the saddest part of all this." I left him standing in his office, surrounded by the evidence of his failures and the ruins of his authority. Walking through the office, I could feel every eye on me, but I didn't stop to explain or say goodbye. Some moments are too significant for casual conversation. The elevator ride down felt like falling in slow motion, each floor bringing me closer to a future I'd chosen rather than one that had been imposed on me. When the doors opened in the lobby, I walked out into the Denver morning with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The next 3 months were a whirlwind of change and vindication. Mark was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation that became a board-level inquiry that eventually led to his resignation. The company hired external consultants to assess the damage his policies had caused, and their findings were even worse than my report had suggested. Several major clients did follow us to Zentrix Tech, though others remained loyal to Orion due to long-term contracts and institutional relationships. The exodus wasn't complete, but it was significant enough to impact Orion's quarterly performance and trigger a comprehensive review of their management practices. Working at Zentrix has been challenging in entirely different ways. The expectations are higher, the pace is faster, and the responsibility is enormous. But it's the difference between being pushed to excel and being crushed under impossible demands. My team trusts me because I've proven that I'll fight for them when necessary. They work hard because they know their efforts are valued, not exploited. 6 months after leaving Orion, I ran into Mark at a coffee shop near our old office. He looked tired, older somehow, wearing jeans and a polo shirt instead of his usual corporate uniform. His hair was longer, less carefully styled, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. We stood in line together for an awkward moment before he spoke. "Ryan, Mark, how's the new job?" "Good. How are you doing?" He shrugged, a gesture that seemed genuinely casual for the first time since I'd known him. "Consulting work, mostly. Helping small companies with digital transformations. It's different." We ordered our coffee and found ourselves sitting at the same table. Former adversaries sharing an unexpected moment of normalcy. The conversation was stilted at first, full of corporate pleasantries and careful neutrality. Then Mark said something that surprised me. "I think about that day a lot. The day you quit. I think I knew you were right. Even then." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving justification. Instead, I saw something I hadn't expected: genuine remorse. "I was scared," he continued. "The promotion, the pressure from above, the budget cuts. I was in over my head from day one. Instead of admitting it, I thought I could power through by making everyone else work harder. You fired good people, Mark, people who trusted you. I know. I've apologized to each of them personally. It doesn't fix anything, but it needed to be said." We sat in silence for a moment. Two men who had been shaped by the same corporate machinery in vastly different ways. "The thing is," Mark said finally, "I always thought the system was the problem. Bad management, unrealistic expectations, impossible deadlines. It never occurred to me that I could become part of that system so easily. Power reveals character," I said. "It doesn't create it." "Yeah, I learned that the hard way." He finished his coffee and stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, you handled that whole situation better than I would have. You found a way to win without destroying anyone. I wasn't trying to destroy you, Mark. I was trying to save myself." After he left, I sat alone with my coffee, thinking about power and choices and the paths that lead us away from who we thought we were. Mark's transformation had been dramatic and public, but in some ways, mine had been just as significant. I'd learned that standing up for yourself doesn't require tearing others down, that strength comes from building something better rather than demolishing what exists. The revenge I'd imagined in those first angry moments after the layoffs, the complete destruction of Mark's career, the public humiliation, the permanent professional exile, had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more satisfying. He'd faced consequences for his actions, but he'd also been given the opportunity to learn from them and become better. Real revenge, I realized, isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about building a life so successful and fulfilling that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant. It's about creating value instead of eliminating obstacles, about lifting people up instead of tearing them down. 6 months later, Jared called to tell me that Orion DataWorks had approached him about returning as VP of Engineering. They'd offered him a significant raise and the authority to rebuild the technical team according to his vision. He was considering it. "They need someone who understands both the technical and human sides of management," he said. "Someone who won't make the same mistakes Mark made." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about the people still there who deserve better leadership. I'm thinking about the clients who need reliable solutions. I'm thinking about giving that company a chance to remember what it used to be before fear and politics took over." Jared took the job, and within a year, Orion's technical reputation had largely recovered. They instituted new policies around workforce management, created employee advocacy programs, and established clear checks and balances to prevent the kind of authoritarian overreach that had characterized Mark's tenure. It wasn't a complete transformation. Corporate culture changes slowly and imperfectly, but it was progress. The people who remained at Orion began to feel valued again, and new hires spoke positively about the work environment and growth opportunities. Nina and Luis eventually left Zentrix as well, but to start their own consulting firm specializing in digital transformation for mid-sized companies. They offered me a partnership position, which I seriously considered before deciding to stay at Zentrix for at least another year. The experience of building something from the ground up was too valuable to abandon prematurely. Looking back now, almost 2 years after that gray Friday morning when Mark threw those papers on my desk, I understand that the whole experience was less about corporate politics and more about personal evolution. Every decision I made, from collecting evidence to confronting Mark to leaving Orion to thriving at Zentrix, was part of a process of discovering who I really was when tested by adversity. The wrinkled gray shirt I wore that day still hangs in my closet, but now it serves a different purpose. It's a reminder that settling for less than you deserve is a choice, not a necessity. That accepting impossible demands is a form of complicity in your own exploitation. That sometimes the most professional thing you can do is refuse to be professional in the face of unprofessional treatment. I kept the workload assessment I'd prepared, all 47 pages of analysis and documentation. It sits in a file folder in my home office, next to the 12-page report that changed everything. Occasionally, I review them when colleagues ask for advice about difficult workplace situations. The documents serve as templates for how to build a case, how to document problems systematically, and how to present information in ways that can't be dismissed or ignored. But more than tactical resources, they represent something more fundamental about standing up for yourself in environments designed to make you feel powerless. They prove that individual actions can have systemic consequences, that careful preparation can overcome institutional advantages, and that treating people badly always carries risks that extend beyond immediate convenience. The most important lesson from the whole experience wasn't about corporate strategy or workplace politics. It was about the difference between revenge and justice, between destruction and construction, between tearing down and building up. Real strength doesn't come from your ability to hurt people who have hurt you. It comes from your ability to create something better than what existed before. Mark's story didn't end with his resignation from Orion. He spent a year doing consulting work, then took a position as CTO at a smaller technology company in Boulder. From what I hear through industry connections, he's doing well there, applying the lessons he learned from his failures at Orion to build a more collaborative and sustainable team culture. He sent me a LinkedIn message last year, congratulating me on a promotion and thanking me for handling our confrontation with more integrity than he'd deserved. It was a brief message, but it reflected a self-awareness that had been completely absent during his time as my boss. People can change, apparently, when the consequences of not changing become clear enough. The technology industry is surprisingly small. Despite its global reach, people move between companies, maintaining professional relationships that span decades and multiple job changes. Reputation matters more than most people realize, and word travels faster than anyone expects. The way you treat people during difficult times becomes part of your permanent professional record, whether you intend it or not. I've been contacted by several former Orion employees over the past 2 years, people who heard about my confrontation with Mark and wanted advice about their own workplace challenges. Each conversation reinforces my belief that most workplace toxicity stems from people feeling powerless to address problems through normal channels. The formal complaint process at most companies is designed to protect the organization, not the employee. HR departments exist primarily to minimize legal exposure, not to ensure fair treatment. Grievance procedures often favor people with institutional power over those who actually create value. Understanding these realities is the first step toward developing effective strategies for dealing with them. But the most important realization from my experience is that you always have more power than you think. The feeling of helplessness that comes from being mistreated by people in authority positions is real, but it's not permanent. Information is power, documentation is power, professional relationships are power, expertise is power, the ability to walk away is power. Mark thought he held all the cards because he had the authority to fire me. He didn't understand that my knowledge, relationships, and reputation were assets he couldn't control or confiscate. When he tried to exploit my dedication to the work, he created leverage I could use against him. When he underestimated my intelligence and preparation, he gave me advantages he didn't even realize existed. The gray shirt still hangs in my closet, but I bought better ones. The desk in my Zentrix office has pictures of Naomi and our dog, awards from satisfied clients, and a small plant that Nina gave me when I got the CTO position. It's the workspace of someone who feels valued and secure, not someone desperately trying to prove their worth to people who have already decided they're disposable. 3 weeks ago, I received a call from a recruiter representing Orion DataWorks. They wanted to discuss opportunities for experienced technology leaders, specifically mentioning their need for someone who understood both technical excellence and team management. The irony wasn't lost on me. I politely declined the conversation, but not because I harbor any lingering resentment toward the company. Orion has apparently learned from its mistakes and genuinely improved its culture under Jared's leadership. I turned down the opportunity because I'm exactly where I need to be, doing work that challenges me with people who respect me in an environment that values growth over exploitation. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being happy, not the aggressive, performative happiness of someone trying to prove a point, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who has built a life aligned with their values and priorities. Mark's opinion of me became irrelevant the moment I stopped working for him. His ability to affect my career ended when I demonstrated that my value extended beyond his recognition or approval. The confrontation that seemed so dramatic and significant at the time was really just a moment of clarity in a longer process of professional and personal development. The real victory wasn't embarrassing Mark or documenting his failures. It was discovering that I had the courage and competence to demand better treatment and create better opportunities. If you find yourself in a similar situation, being asked to do impossible things by people who treat you as disposable, remember that you have more options than you realize. Document everything. Build relationships beyond your immediate workplace. Develop skills that transfer between companies. Maintain professional standards even when others abandon them. And never let anyone convince you that accepting abuse is part of being professional. The most powerful thing you can do when faced with impossible demands isn't to prove you can meet them. It's to demonstrate that you understand the difference between challenging work and exploitative expectations, between high standards and unrealistic requirements, between being valued and being used. Sometimes the strongest response to being told you're replaceable is to replace yourself, not in anger or spite, but in pursuit of an environment where your contributions are genuinely appreciated. Sometimes the most professional thing you can do is walk away from people who have forgotten that professionalism is supposed to be mutual. And sometimes, when someone throws papers on your desk like they're dealing cards in a poker game, the best response is to show them that you've been holding better cards all along. You just needed the right moment to play them.